people think deeply, really scrutinize the evidence, question assumptions, and find new ideas for both old and new challenges. And this has perhaps never been more important than as we grapple with a global pandemic that has had unpredictable and often concerning impacts on the global movement of people, including in some cases making migration riskier and costlier and in some places more disorderly. It sometimes feels a little bit like we are moving from crisis to crisis, whether it's Afghan evacuation, what's happening in Belarus, or the US southern border. But of course, these are happening against the backdrop of much larger shifts that govern how people move and will move in the future, including climate-related displacement and the uneven spread of economic opportunities. So this is a critical time to be assessing these questions about the kind of migration systems that we want to build for the future and the kind of governance that will support strategic thinking to get ahead of these challenges. I do feel a bit strange to have been robbed of my opportunity to introduce our two distinguished speakers, but I won't repeat the stuff you know already, and I'll get stuck straight in. I wanted to divide today's discussion a bit like the Christmas Carol into vignettes of migration past, present, and future. So if I could start with the ancient history bit, which is Demetrios' favorite. The two of you have known each other, I hear, for longer than the history of MPI. I wanted to start with you, António. When you look back at the last 20 years, what's changed and what are the issues that you see come round again and again and again that countries have to grapple with?
Thank you so much, Megan, and good afternoon to all of you. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here for the 20th anniversary of MPI. I'm particularly pleased because this is the 70th anniversary of IOM this year, and my age is somewhere in between. And having said that, it's very dangerous to ask a Portuguese what has happened in the last 20 years, because most likely you will be very fatalist and pessimist. So I will try to be a little bit un-Portuguese, saying that with my age and my experience, I've learned that the progress is always a paradox. And what has happened in these last 20 years, in my view, in migration policy, is progress, but with paradoxes. Progress because indeed today, I think, there is evidence, more than evidence, overwhelming evidence, that the challenges of migratory flows and to deal with migration policy cannot be coped by one country alone in isolation. There is a need for joint efforts because migration is a joint endeavor. But being essentially human phenomenon, you also need to constantly adapt your positioning and adapt to changing realities. And if it is true that no one can cope alone with migration, I think that we have come to the conclusion in the last 20 years that there is a need of a shared responsibility in the international community. And coming to the position of shared responsibility concerns not only the countries of destination, but also the countries of origin. When it comes to countries of destination, it is quite clear that today it is evident that countries of destination have a responsibility in addressing the deep root causes of migration. But no longer as 20 years ago, where the speech about the deep root causes was something like vague and abstract. But the challenge today is to find effective tools to translate these principle of addressing the deep root causes into concrete action. And then in that sense, there has been progress. There has also been progress in the perspective of the countries of origin. Because to a large extent, countries of origins consider that, the fate of migrants was their problem. It was not their responsibility. And progressively, countries of origin have recognized that they are also accountable before their public opinions about how they deal with the migration flows that originate in those countries of origin. And the paradox lies in the fact that recently, in the last 10 years probably, there is a rise in unilateralism looking to So overwhelming evidence of shared responsibility, but on the other side, a sort of escape route, or if you want, a detour from certain areas, trying to say that, well, building walls, building fences, closing the doors, that's the way we deal with migration. That's the basic paradox I see in the last 20 years. And last but not least, this process is a process of advancement and setbacks. We can never take anything for granted. And it requires strategies from both sides to build mutual confidence. And build mutual confidence is probably the most difficult thing to build in today's world. But looking back to the 20 years, and I conclude with this, when I see that at least it has been possible for the vast majority of United Nations member states to come to an agreement with a political platform called Global Compact on Safe, Regular, and Orderly Migration, that shows that there is the goodwill and the political capital to build upon to consolidate mutual trust and to have a joint shared responsibility in terms of migratory flows. And I hope that this appeal is also particularly heard in the city that so generously hosts us today.
Thank you so much, Antonio. And Dimitri, same question, but I challenge you to come up with anything catchier than progress with paradox.
Well, what can I say? I'll start with my age, which exceeds
the history of IOM.
the history of IOM, which is something to be proud of. So my sense is that the last point that Antonio made, that it's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, and several steps sideways, is pretty much the same thing that it was 20 years ago, or for that matter, 30 or 40 years ago. We have tried an awful lot of things in the United States, and certainly the European Union. Antonio was the first ever commissioner for this issue. At that time, it was called Justice and Home Affairs, is it? Am I right?
Absolutely.
Justice and Home Affairs. Progress has been made. Certainly, expertise has built up enormously. A political will on the part of the European institutions has grown. It is really much higher than it was, let's say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But at the end of the day, we continue to have the same old problems appear and sort of destroy whatever it is that we're trying to build again and again and again. So the challenges are very similar. How do you basically work collaboratively, cooperatively, whatever you want to call it? Because we all know somewhere inside of us, and every policymaker I talk to, and I'm sure every policymaker that Antonio talks to, says, yeah, we have to work together. That's the answer. And then the but comes. But, domestic politics. But look at what happened, in Poland, between Poland and Belarus. Look at what is going on in the US southern border, et cetera, et cetera. It is that but that is really killing us in terms of making progress on this issue. And people like us, and particularly, academics, think that all of those things somehow can be fixed by coming up with more elegant wording and by saying more interesting things differently. But in reality, those things do not change the facts on the ground. These are the challenges. The opportunities that international migration produces or creates are also the same. All along, we all know that what created this institution, the language that created this institution, which is essentially that international migration, when managed well and responsibly, can bring many more benefits for everyone. For immigrants and the communities and the families that are left behind, for the communities in which they enter and become members of in our countries. And that these kinds of things have never changed, nor for that matter, in my estimation and talking to far too many people in the last 50 years, I will say that nothing has changed about what it is that immigrants think of immigration. They come here for the same reasons that they came 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 70 or 100 years ago, to better and improve their conditions and create better opportunities for their families, for their children. Now, things have sort of changed at the margin, but this will require a paper rather than an answer to your question. And one last thing, what it is that we don't have, didn't have it 20 years ago, although maybe around 30 years ago when we started to get serious about the relationship with Mexico, things were different for a few years, but we do not have the combination of courage and wisdom that is required to take on successfully, or at least more successfully than in the past, the more difficult issues. And this is really what is holding us back, because increasingly in places like my country here, and in places, in far too many other places, what we are experiencing is the lack of courage. So the extremes in either position can block pretty much any thoughtful action on this matter. These are the conditions that are there that we have to constantly try to do better with, to improve upon. We haven't been able to do that systematically and continuously, because there has been progress, whether it's the two global compacts or at least, the global compact that was more difficult, which was the migration compact. The other one institutionalizes things that, pretty much exist, but the ability to put together a document that I know it's full of compromises. And if you've been in this business, long enough, you can see the fingerprints of which group, which individual, which country put some of these provisions in there. There is the beauty of this global compact on migration is that there is nothing new under it. But it is a single document that basically tries to make the case how we can move forward better. I'll shut up now, man.
Doesn't it always require a paper? So both of you painted a vision of incremental progress, the 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and perhaps a little bit of deja vu or old wine in new bottles for Dimitri. But then we have the pandemic, or as I like to call it, the ghost of migration present. And I wanted to start with Antonio. This last 18 months has seen a really unprecedented impact on human mobility in relation to border closures and just the massive scale of travel restrictions. Now we have vaccination requirements emerging, these complex COVID protocols. Is this a world that's reopening? And what are the implications for people on the move?
Dimitri, since you're good friends, do you mind sharing your mic with Antonio, actually? We keep getting word that your mic is a better one.
I'm sorry.
Audience, yes.
It's a bit of a hierarchy.
We can both project better.
Well, in the beginning of the pandemic, I always tell this story. I read an article in a very well-known magazine saying the pandemic is the end of migration. And so I was sitting in my office and I said, well, better start packing and go back to Lisbon. At least there is sunshine, which is not the case in Geneva. But in practical terms, yes, we were confronted for an organization that is based on migration, which means movement of people. The pandemic and the world came to a stop, was totally unprecedented and totally unpredictable. So we had no alternative but to adapt. And adapt means identifying what will be the impacts of the pandemic First in our staff, of course, in the safety of our staff. We had an enormous amount of problems, for instance, with lockdowns, because our staff were unable to reach out to beneficiaries. We kept the organization tuned in delivering support to the beneficiaries, but at the same time, the measures that were being taken to fight the pandemic were preventing us from performing our duty. Secondly, we found a new category of migrants that we call stranded migrants. Migrants that were on their way both to countries of destination or migrants that were on their way back to the country of origin, precisely because of the pandemic, that suddenly got stuck because of the closure of the borders, because of the cancellation of the flights, because of the lockdowns, and they were in need of assistance. And thirdly, we realized that immediately after the beginning of the pandemic, there has been a drop in irregular moves. I mean, the networks, the criminal networks that operate in trafficking in human beings and in smuggling did slow down, indeed. But that was just for a short period of time. They were very fast in adapting to the new situation. And due to the fact that moving regularly became almost impossible, they had there a unique opportunity to broaden their business. I always tell this story. There are figures that probably are not very well known. In a conversation with one head of state, head of government of the European Union, I explained to the person in question that in 2019, the Gulf of Aden, from Djibouti to Yemen, in direction to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, have been crossed by 150,000 people, more than the ones that crossed the Mediterranean from Central, Eastern, and Western Mediterranean. This figure came to a drop significantly in 2020 because of the pandemic, roughly 37,000. But what we have seen is that those migrants coming from the Horn of Africa, going to Yemen, a country at war, and a very difficult situation, trying to reach Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, being unable to reach the objective, they try to come back to the countries of origin. Again, through Yemen, again, through the Gulf of Aden. And the traffickers and the smugglers cover twice, because they get the payment of the way trip and then they get the payment of the way back trip. And this situation was totally new. It did not exist before. So we had to adapt to this new landscape, new environment, which is very demanding for the future. I think we can speak about that more in detail a little later. But the truth is that we are not reopening the world now. We should not look to the world in the perspective of the global north. In the global north, the vaccination rate is 62%, and even then you see the figures on the rise in Europe very recently. But it's true that there is a smooth of restrictions and mutual recognition of certificates. I just came to the US with my Switzerland vaccination certificate. But what I am afraid is that that's not the panorama in the vast majority of the world. In the less developed countries, the rate of vaccination is 4%. In Africa, in the entire continent, the rate of vaccination does not reach 10%. So we are not opening the world. On the contrary, we are still very much living under the pandemic and the conditionality that the pandemic imposed to the freedom of movement. What I'm a little bit afraid is of two things. First, this opening becomes an harmony. You start opening and closing and opening and closing with a lack of predictability, lack of certainty. We never know if we can travel for a country according to some rules, but then the rules change. So there is a need to have a joint approach to the common rules, common standards that should be used to open up after the pandemic. And the second one is that we might be going to a two-tier, if not a three-tier mobility system worldwide. Those from the rich countries that can have vaccines can travel freely or more freely, and those who come from less developed countries will find much more difficult to move around. Not to mention that of one thing I'm certain, in the future, border controls and migration systems will have to integrate health-proof criteria. That's quite clear. And this will require investments in infrastructures for border controls, investment in skills for border guards, and investment in skills for the migration officials. And not all countries will be on equal foot, capable to deploy the necessary investments to guarantee that the global mobility is developed. And there is no economic recovery, no world trade, no global recovery in the economy if there is no global mobility. The good microphone to you, sir.
So, who can disagree with what António said? It makes eminent sense, and it is highly likely, in fact, almost certain, that it will take time before we develop these common standards. After all, if you can think back to 2001 when Jim Ziegler was commissioner, Doris Meissner had just left the commissioner's office after 9/11, it took us several years before we could agree on all the standards, common standards, that would control or manage movement, mobility. And here I like to draw a distinction between mobility and migration, because I like to talk about migration more than I like to talk about mobility, because that's what I know most. And because mobility is at least as essential as António says, but there are going to be ways, I suspect, that this is going to be sort of be put together. The infrastructure is going to be put together, although not in a way that will make mobility easy as it was, back in the old days, 2019, for instance. Okay, and trade and everything else that is very much dependent on the ability to move people, cargoes, etc., will suffer for a while. But again, at the end of the day, I hope that the new standards that we all agree on, will be able to be adapted and followed by everyone. And the most important standard is preparing ourselves for the next pandemic. Because even if it takes an extra year to come up with the right kinds of standards, if the outcome is being much better prepared for the next pandemic, I can live with it. Now, trade people might not be willing to live with that, but this is something that we need to do. And that's extremely important to me. With regard to migration, I often get asked questions about what will the post-pandemic opening look like. And being an old dog in this game, I say that very quickly, I don't know if that's 6 months or 18 months, it's going to look pretty much the way that it looked before all of these things started. In other words, I don't see any country adapting their immigration systems to somehow make different kinds of decisions about migration. There are countries that have already opened up, or at least have found intelligent, fast, quick, smart ways of creating hybrid systems whereby migration, like Canada, like migration can actually happen both in person or in a hybrid sort of a way from abroad. Because all sorts of changes are taking place, have taken place because of the pandemic. It's now clear that many jobs don't have to be done in place. And I don't mean, jobs like the MPI crew can work from home. if Andrew decides that this is what they can do. I'm talking about the kinds of things that are necessary for people to be able to do their jobs from where they are. And with all of the advances in AI and technology and mechanization and all that, I have a hard time trying to figure out how many immigrants we would need. So immigration will have to become, at least for a period of time, hybrid. People over there earning, hopefully, the right over time to move over here, but doing jobs from their homes. And this actually is something that can make a big difference in our ability to have a migration system that continues to benefit most of the people who engage it. One last thing. I can't resist this because we're fascinated with smugglers. And I don't mean fascinated as in so happy that they're doing so well. Everybody's talking about smuggling. In fact, a few years ago, names will not be used to protect the not so innocent. The great invention of some people in the EU was to attack the smugglers, burn their boats, cut off this and that and the other thing. And on this side of the Atlantic, the big innovation was, let's try to attack the smugglers. Smugglers are infinitely adaptable, and they can change everything, routes, method, etc., on a dime. And they don't care if you die. The cargo is expendable. They collect their money. Anything, as Antonio said, under any set of circumstances, they get paid. And no country is capable to actually make a dent in this because they offer a service. Because people who are desperate or people who are not so desperate are stupid enough to think that somehow, let's say, think of the caravans. There is safety in numbers. Or think of the people who are trying to cross, the Mediterranean. There is safety in numbers. You know what? Or we're good swimmers. Or I'll go with my 3 cousins and we'll help each other. In reality, people die. And they die in very large numbers. And the death rates move from the Eastern Mediterranean to the sort of Central Mediterranean, Western Mediterranean. In the last few years, some of the largest activity of illegal migration is from, always a hard time, from West Africa to the Canary Islands. East and West for me doesn't quite work because I don't know what's East, West, North, or South. So the reality, in other words, is that smugglers will always be with us. Governments can never be as swift, can neither adapt, and they have to follow rules. Smugglers don't have to follow rules. So the reality becomes that smugglers will be perfectly alive and well, that they will continue to make a lot of money, and that just about anything that we do trying to control the unauthorized movement of people plays precisely into making smugglers richer. And that is the reality. Now, some people may take the lesson from that reality that, maybe we should have a good time, relax, and let people come in. That's how governments lose their money, their jobs. And that's how social revolutions in small letters rather than large letters begin to happen. And now, since all of our countries are highly divided, our countries is the advanced industrial world, and so divided over this issue, the idea that somehow we can just about bring into our countries most of the people who make it to our borders is actually, I'm trying to find a soft word, because the word that comes to my mind is not a soft word. It doesn't make much sense. How is that? So working together within neighborhoods becomes the only way to try to manage better the unauthorized movement of people. And everything that you do at the end point affects what happens with the next group. And if you don't have the clarity to understand this and act on this, then you will constantly have a crisis situation.
Thank you. Both of you talked about migration intermediaries and smugglers and how this might be a moment, well, they acted very flexibly and been very adaptive, but also that this might be a moment when their business model takes off. But what about the other side of irregular migration and the individual decision-making process for migrants, Antonio? What changes the individual calculus? Will legal pathways ever be enough?
Well, maybe I'd start by saying that regular pathways will never put an end to irregular migrations. The idea that there is a system of communication that if you increase one, you will decrease the others, in my view, does not work. A different story is to say if we are much more proactive in promoting regular pathways, that strengthens not just the argument to fight against irregular migration, but also that is to the benefit of those migrants who can migrate without taking the risks that irregular migration always poses to them, putting in risk their lives and giving opportunity for the most atrocious abuses of migrants. But in fact, Dimitri was raising a question that probably the jury is very much still out. Some jobs can be performed remotely, others cannot be performed remotely. So there will always be a need to address the question of regular migration according to a number of criteria and rules in cooperation with the countries of origin, and also bearing in mind that there is room for seasonal migration in order to open up opportunities for those who are looking for the improvement of their own lives. The pandemic, from that point of view, was very interesting. Some countries have organized charter flights for seasonal migrants in order not to lose their crops. And so they raised a waiver from the travel restrictions and from the closure of the borders to allow seasonal migrants to come to the crops and then go back to the countries of origin. And so the flexibility in managing migratory flows will go on being a crucial issue. I do not want to forget that the vast majority, 60% probably, even more in some cases, of migrants that are in irregular situations in countries of destination did not cross the border irregularly. They just became in an irregular situation because they have overstayed their visas or have overstayed their authorization of stay in the countries of destination. So don't misunderstand me. I think it is very important to have efficient, smart, effective border controls. But if you start creating the idea that does the job, that is enough, you will be confronted with a reality that presents you a picture that is very different. Because a substantial part of those who are in irregular situations in countries of destination would not have been stopped at the border because they crossed the border regularly. This shows that in the debate that we have in our societies, migration has become a very polarized issue, a very sensitive issue of political infighting. And one has to recognize with some humility that the rhetorics of the populism has the enormous advantage of presenting solutions that are simple and easy to be understood by the public opinion. They will not do the job. They will not make any difference. They will not solve the problems, but at least they are very easy to be understood by the public opinion. And our job, it requires much more sophistication in the way we approach the problems, and we find it much more difficult to explain it to the public opinion. And that is also a challenge for us that believe that, as Demetrios said, that migration has positive impacts. It's not enough to say, to present the figures and say, you see the figures. They contribute more to the social security and to the economy that they get from social security. That's no longer enough. That's true, but that will not do the job. So we need to be capable, not just to demonstrate how wrong are the arguments against migration, but we also need to be much more effective in making the case for, first, the positive impacts of migration, and secondly, not hiding the challenges and the obstacles for migration, because there are difficult issues that need to be tackled in terms of integration, in terms of living together, in terms of the changing of the shape of the societies of destination. Those elements should not be hidden. We need to take them seriously and to demonstrate that the public policies and the mobilization of the civil society and of the private sector addresses those challenges in order to guarantee the security of the entire coast.
Thank you. I think we should have chosen a different duet, okay? Because you have to have some significant disagreements in order for the audience here and virtually whatever this thing is, to be satisfied that they had an argument. So I can't argue with anything that António said, but I will make a couple of observations. Sometimes, well, I'll start with some that I want to really emphasize, underline. As to policymakers and people in debates have to really accept the fact that people experience immigration differently, which is extremely important because it shapes how they feel about immigration. And in addition to that, that it is very important for us to be talking with them, not at them. We cannot go around sort of thinking or saying, like a short time Prime Minister of the UK said about 8 or 10 years ago. And when I say 8 or 10 years ago, you know, who knows?
We get there. We get there.
We get that.
We get there.
Who basically said, that stupid woman. And guess what? The microphone was open. And the stupid woman was somebody who was actually saying things that he didn't want to hear about immigration. So it's important that we respect each other. And it is important that we understand that people have different viewpoints because they experience migration differently. Another point that I want to again underline, because these are important, critically important things. Legal pathways, more legal pathways. You should do that on its own merits. People say we should offer more scholarships, fellowships, you know, this and that to students from over there, whatever the over there is. We should do this because it is smart. Smart for the students, smart for the receiving society, because the lowest hanging fruit of immigration is indeed students who have studied in your own country, and they provide often, but we're not going to go there. And in addition to that, they create an opportunity for those people who do stay, who do return to their homes, to become to create circles, positive circles or cycles, and sort of become an engine of change in their own country. These are all important things. These are all good things. But what António said, If anybody thinks or tells you that somehow doing so, and even doing so in a significant way, will somehow address the pressure for unauthorized immigration or reduce the number of people who want to come to a better country, a country in which they will have more opportunities, this is pretty downright wrong. This isn't going to happen because, at least at this time, the number of people who want to move, who associate moving outwardly with moving upwardly, creating more opportunities for themselves, is infinite, ladies and gentlemen, infinite. We need to understand that, which means that we have to really begin to think differently about it and act differently. The last thing is also motivated by what António said. He talked about, let's say, the bottom half of the labor market, or the last third of the labor market. People in agriculture, all of these occupations that have long been abandoned by workers in rich societies. I left Greece, God only knows, 50 plus years, 55 years ago, and it was a poor country. And the fishing industry was entirely foreign. In a poor country, all of these industries are gone. So why don't we agree that there is a way to actually create opportunities and bring migrants that will do this work? And why do we not come up with systems that this organization has put on paper in the various commissions and other groupings that MPI put together? Why don't we create opportunities for people to earn permanent status, but starting as temporary workers who are treated fairly, with enforcement, with contracts that have teeth, and after a number of years, these people can earn permanent status. I know why we cannot do these things in the United States, because that part of the labor market appears to be ungovernable. But there are many societies in Europe that actually invest much more in really regulating these labor markets. We need to be smarter about these issues. And if we get smarter over time, we're going to have better outcomes for everyone.
Thank you, Dimitri. I just want to explain what we're going to do with our final 14 minutes. We're going to go to the future questions, and then I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience. And also I have some coming in through my phone. And if those of you watching from home would like to ask a question, you have 3 ways to do it. You can tweet at Migration Policy, you can ask it in the Zoom chat box, or you can email events@migrationpolicy.org. So here's the Future Z question. How do we take forward some of this learning and experimentation from the pandemic and translate that into long-term strategic thinking? And so for Dimitri, how do you move beyond this short-termist thinking and build that strategic muscle, even in countries like the United States, where you think that it's very hard? And then for António, I wondered if you could talk a little bit specifically about climate change, because I was, very interested. We were all watching COP26 so closely. These high-level commitments are so different to the very rich operational work that IOM does. How do you marry some of that long-term futures vision with this learning that's happening at an operational level? António, perhaps we can go to you first.
Since I'm the first one, I will leave the future for the and I will focus on the issue of climate change, because that has been a top priority for IOM in this last year, and it will go on being a priority, because we believe that each time what we see in the field is that slow onset or natural or man-made disasters linked with climate are each time more and more a driver for migration. And for us, it is extremely important to address this challenge in a three-pronged approach. We do recognize that in some cases, migrate can be a coping strategy for related to climate change, and therefore it is necessary to see what are the requirements for those people who, for instance, live in a place that is going to be flooded and it will not be possible to live more. But I always recall that when I was in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh a couple of months ago, I was told that there was a certain village in the riverside that was going to be flooded. The people of that village was displaced to another place, safer. They lived there for a couple of months, and then they decided to build houses on pillars in the primitive area where they had lived, and they start living in a lacuster village as a reaction, because they were so attached to the place where they were born and they were living that they decided not to move, but go back and adapt. I think this is the question: adapt. Adaptation is going to be for us a crucial issue. For people who want to move, for people that are on the move, some people are on the move. Like for instance, if you look to the Sahel, you have a devastating impact of salinization, of the scarcity of water. You have now less land available being disputed by farmers and by herders. And it's necessary to create the conditions for the two communities to live together without tensions, which is not easy. But that is a consequence of the scarcity of the available land for their livelihood. And this is a situation where people are on the move because of climate change. And last but not least, in confronted with the climate change, there is a need to build resilience in the communities, to start preparing and adapting for what might happen in terms of impacts of climate change. And these three prongs are for us our focus, not just a theoretical focus. We do it in practice. That's what we do. We are very much working, whether in the Pacific Islands, whether in the Sahel, in the coastal countries of West Africa. If you want, this is part also of the debate here in the US about what is happening in Central America. The impacts of the Rio Seco area in the economies of the countries of Central America, its impact on the production of coffee and of cocoa, and therefore the need for people to find alternative ways of living. So in this case, we work on the concrete terms. And so our advocacy on the impact of climate change and migration is very much based on what we see and what we do in practical terms. And I would like to emphasize that we welcome very much the recent report here in the US from the White House about precisely the impact of climate change in migration and mobility in general, because it is absolutely necessary in our view to give visibility to this subject, because I have much respect for the debate about reduction in emissions in 2030, 2040, 2050. Much respect, it's crucial, it's essential. But we should not forget that climate change is already changing the lives of people today, now. And to those we need to find also an answer. And COP26 did not give much proeminence to this point. It was very much about the reductions of emissions, the carbon market, the fossil fuel. But I hope that we can build a coalition of goodwill for COP27, where the impacts of climate change in livelihoods and in migration will have the necessary attention in the framework of adaptation and mitigation.
while Dimitri answers his future's question, if anyone who is hoping to speak can raise your hands and then we can get a roving mic to you efficiently. Dimitri, are we doing enough to plan for the future?
Sure. In fact, we have solved so many problems today that if we kept this up until 10 o'clock tonight, the future will
Next
be
time, the
5-hour panel. So, I will say 4 things, not because Andrew said 1 minute, which is not possible. It takes me a minute to clear my throat, as you have pointed out. But because I think it's important for us to be thinking about these terms. Can you hear me better back there? No. So, Lisa, what's going on? I mean, I'm told to keep it right here. Oh, do it this way? Oh, well, my arm will fall off. Some things that, I continue to be concerned about. What 5 years ago used to be black swan events, Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, 2015, 2016, et cetera, are now commonplace. And if we don't figure out how to not just prevent them, and I don't mean prevent them by force, to address, and that comes to the future and to climate change, to address them in a serious way by working with countries before conflict becomes endemic and then forces us to do nothing more than simply try to live and manage the consequences, because people are going to be living in large numbers, then we're dead. The second one is we're seeing less and less logic in allowing the federal government, the central government, whatever you want to call it, make all immigration decisions. It won't work that way in the future. Devolution is the way that we're likely to manage this issue. So you're going to have your Barcelona, making its own rules about, benefits, who is a citizen, et cetera, or for that matter, British Columbia or others, while the federal government, the central government, will try to sort of create rules that apply to everyone. Think of what happened as a reaction to who was the last president that we had here? Okay, I know the name. As a reaction to that, with a lot of cities, basically saying, we're going to do these many things on our own. This is going to become more and more common. And it's not just Barcelona. I just use it as a single example. In the UK, it's not just federal governments, okay? Unitary, or what we used to call unitary governments, are moving in that direction too. The third one is we have to really commit to management of the migration issue, both in terms of our rhetoric and in terms of our actions. It matters a great deal that we come up with ways that we can manage migration better, much, much better than we do it. And last point, and this is a very difficult point, and I don't know if you were going to ask it or not. This connection between demography and migration is one of the most complicated questions, both in terms of policy and analytics. Everybody pretends that, there is no connection, or that the connection is linear. When the United States Census Bureau announced that, the fertility, total fertility, I don't want to bother you with all of these definitions, the total fertility rate went down to 1.8%. You need a little more than, two women having 2 children or adopting children from the outside or whatever in order to keep a steady population. The fact remains that everybody jumped on this. We have a demographic deficit. Let's bring immigrants. It doesn't work that way. Immigrants also age. And they also will do 20 and 30 years from now, they will have the same needs, they will be accessing the same money, retirement money, et cetera, and they will need the same services as everybody else. Why not take things a little more slowly? Yes, the immigration and immigrants will always be part of the answer. Always. But they're not going to be the answer to anything. And this is extremely important for us. I have stopped now. I'm not talking anymore.
And this is where I break the rules and run over by a couple of minutes because we started late. Thank you. I think there's a question in the back and I can't see that far. So if you could introduce yourself, that would be wonderful.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to share with you today. I'm Juan Carlos Viloria Doria. I'm part of the more than 6 million Venezuelans who have to flee our country. I'm currently the president of Coalition for Venezuela. On behalf of our federation, I congratulate the MPI for its anniversary. Distinguished panelists, especially Mr. António Vitorino. What do you think should be the role of organized civil society? How can IOM strengthen to contribute in host country? As the second question, if it is possible, how can IOM ensure the protection of all people, especially migrants, in compliance with the global path for a safe, orderly, and regular migration? Me, as all the migrants, we can contribute to the implementation of policies that will most effectively benefit our communities and also the host country.
Great, thank you so much. Antonio.
Well, on the first point, the answer is very straightforward. We have always insisted on the need to mobilize the Venezuelan diaspora to address the situation of the Venezuelan displaced in several countries in Latin America. And therefore, the platform that we have together with UNHCR and 159 organizations also include, of course, the contribution of the Venezuelan diaspora to support the migrants and refugees that have spread all over Latin America. So the answer on that point is extremely positive, encouraging, and saying that they are part of the solution, and we appreciate their contribution. On the first issue, I think that we have seen to the situation in Latin America, particularly as a consequence of the Venezuela case, as an humanitarian emergency, and it is. But we need to start looking at it from a different perspective, because quite a large number of those who have been displaced are now confronted with the challenge of fully integrating in the host society. And that is a challenge not only for the displaced people, but also for the host communities. And some of the difficulties that we have found is that some rejection of the host communities to the displaced people is due to the fact that the ones who come, Venezuelans, represent an extra burden to the host communities in terms of access to social services. So the approach needs to be integrated in the sense that we cannot just confine ourselves to the support, the humanitarian support to the displaced people, but focus each time more and more the support to the host communities, so that we can smooth the relationship between the ones who come and the ones who welcome the displaced people.
Thank you, and I hope you don't mind if I skip you. We have a question over there. Is that Alex? I can't tell in your mask.
Alex.
It is.
Alex Lenikov. Really interesting, and congratulations, MPI. Let me put it this way. Yes, there will always be migration. Yes, there will always be smuggling. Yes, borders will not work perfectly. But I'm wondering if you can expand the context a little bit and why people are moving. And yes, they're moving without their position. But I haven't heard a discussion of global inequality. hard to think you can make progress on these events, on everything we're talking about, if there's not a serious effort to reduce the world inequality that produces the kinds of migration we're talking about. Because in a world of a much more equal world, you wouldn't have these kinds of pressures. And I'm just wondering how you can put that into your analysis. Antonio, you were talking about we need smart borders that work and we have to have border controls. But in a world that we live in, those kinds of borders inevitably become borders that preserve privilege for the countries that have. And they keep people out who want to be here because they've been impoverished, often by the countries that are trying to keep them out. How you put that into
Let's take a final word from both of you. And if you could keep it extremely short and sweet, I'm going to get into so much trouble already.
Thank you very much.
That was short and sweet.
Alex, as always, a provocateur, which is a good thing. But you and I are not going to live in a world where inequality will sort of be diminished enough to really make a difference. In fact, nor will our children. So this may sound like a good way to sort of think about these issues as a thinking exercise, but as an exercise in reality is something that I don't think makes any sense. Unless, of course, you're proposing the dismantling of nation states. And, you could say that since the middle 17th century, what is that, 400, plus years, the Westphalian system, had a good run at it. But it's not over. It's not likely to be over, and it is not likely to change dramatically without extraordinary upheaval in the rich worlds. So for me, that's why I don't try to, sorry. Antonio, do you want to say something?
No, in 20 seconds, I did not address the issue of inequalities as a driver of migration, but I think that I was sufficiently explicit in identifying the new inequalities that come out of the pandemic, inequalities that have been exacerbated by the pandemics and their impact in terms of mobility, in terms of more border controls, in terms of possibility for migration. I'm not saying that the border controls are the alpha and the omega of everything, but there is one thing we need to take into consideration. Border controls play a role in reassuring the public opinion of the existing countries that those who come into the country are authorized to come to the country. And that is an important element in the narrative to make migrants accepted by the host communities. Give the impression that everything is out of control. I think that the racist and the xenophobic reactions will be much. So there are no magic solutions. Everything depends on the balance. And I think that border controls, the ones that I've tried to describe, are also part of a broader picture that we need to work in.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you both of you for being so disciplined in your final answer. So for MPI's 30th anniversary, we will schedule 2 hours for these wonderful thinkers and speakers. Thank you so much to both of you. This has been a fantastic armchair discussion.